Today we're going to talk about my top 5 fat loss breakfast foods. So these aren't foods that you necessarily have to eat in order to lose fat, but they're going to make your life a whole lot easier. So these are foods that you're going to be able to focus on the majority of the time as your breakfast foods and as your breakfast meals to not have to always be hungry. So we're going to explain a concept called satiety. And what satiety is basically how full that food makes you feel both immediately after eating that food and in the couple hours after that meal as you're actually digesting that meal. So in terms of fat loss, what's important is going to be adherence and compliance over the long term. So if you're focusing on foods that really fill you up and don't leave you feeling hungry, you're going to be able to stick to that a lot better over those 4, 6, 8, 12 weeks that you have to go through that fat loss phase. To give you guys some context in terms of actual fat loss numbers and how this applies to what we're going to talk about, most of you guys are going to need about 2,400 to 3,000 calories a day as your starting point if you're an athlete who's a little bit heavier and needs to go through a brief fat loss phase. So maybe the bigger, more active, faster metabolism guys towards the upper end of that 3,000 calorie range, and the rest of you maybe towards the middle or lower end of that range. Again, adjusting as you need to over the course of that fat loss phase as that actual weight loss plateaus. What this means is that if you're eating about 4 meals a day, that this is going to turn into 600 to about 800 calories per meal. So not huge meals. We don't have a lot of wiggle room here. Again, you might have a little bit more wiggle room with that 800 calorie range, but we're really going to have to be focusing on high quality foods, low calorie density, and high satiety foods to be able to do that consistently over the weeks and months and not stray from that diet and have very high compliance. As far as protein sources, the first thing that we're going to mention in the first food is going to be any sort of low-fat, high-protein Greek yogurt. So this is the Greek yogurt that I get, some sort of variation like this. You're looking for something in the realm of 120 to 130 calories per cup and about 18 to 22 grams of protein per cup as well. So there's a lot of imitation Greek-style yogurts that maybe have 180 calories per cup or 8 grams of protein per cup. We're looking for something that's majority protein for that protein source. That's going to, again, be very low calorie density, but still give you high quality protein and a lot of protein for the amount of food volume that you get. Sticking to the theme of lean protein sources, number 2 is going to be egg whites. So this doesn't mean you have to have only egg whites, but whatever the normal amount of eggs you have, being able to substitute all or part of that as egg whites. So maybe you take your 5-egg omelet and you make that 2 eggs and 5 egg whites, or some sort of substitution to hit your macros. So as an example, here we're showing the differential macros between a 5-egg omelet and a 1-egg and 7-egg white omelet. And again, what you're seeing is about a 200 calorie difference for exactly the same amount of protein. So much better macros if we're trying to actually go through fat loss and again get a lot more food volume for less total calories. Now we're going to get into carb intake. So before we start that, the following 3 foods that we're going to talk about were actually featured in a study on satiety that's been around for a while, where basically they took about 40 different types of foods and they had participants assigned to each food, and they basically allowed them to eat as much of that food as they wanted until they said that they were full. Then they rated how full they were in intervals over the next couple hours. So they had a ranking for each of these foods based on fullness, based on satiety. So the first of these foods and the most satiating food was actually potatoes. So in the study they used boiled potatoes. If you're a fan of boiled potatoes, that's fine. We actually like to use hash browns. So a caveat to this, when we're talking about hash browns, we're not talking about cooking it in 5 tablespoons of oil. We're not talking about going to Waffle House and getting hash browns that are covered in fat. These are straight potatoes. As far as cooking them in the lowest calorie way, the way that you're going to do that is with some sort of 0-calorie cooking spray and then just any sort of seasoning to make it taste good. So it may not be quite as good as what you're getting at Waffle House, but as far as the low-calorie filling option, plain hash browns are a great choice. Number 4 on the list was a close second behind potatoes in the study, and that's going to be oatmeal. So the lowest calorie option is just going to be your regular plain oats. That's going to be a lower calorie option than something like your instant oatmeal. That's going to have sugar already added to it. It's going to have a little bit of fat already added to it. So again, this is fine if you're on a higher calorie diet or you're early on in a fat loss phase where you're able to easily hit those macros. But as you get lower and lower and your calories are further and further into the fat loss phase, or for some of you who are just smaller guys who can't get away with as many calories, what you're going to want to do is just get regular plain oats. So again, very filling. It's a complex carb source, so you're going to get a sustained amount of energy over the course of the day. And you can still make this taste pretty good with any sort of 0-calorie sweetener. So I use Truvia. Again, tastes pretty good, pretty cheap, and makes it taste just as good as a lot of these instant oatmeals that have a little bit higher calorie content. Number 5 on our list, and not far down on the list in that study as far as satiating foods, is going to be any sort of fruit. So in the study they used apples and oranges as their examples, but any sort of juicier fruit. We have peaches right here. A notable exception is going to be bananas. So bananas, again, less water content, more carb content, and those are going to be a little bit higher calorie option that you might want to avoid as you get into your fat loss phase. Worth mentioning in terms of fat intake, we didn't include a fat heavy food in our top 5 list just because fats as a macronutrient tend to be a much more calorie dense source, but you want to make sure you're still getting some fats in your diet. So depending on how many calories you have to play with, there should be a little bit of fat with each meal. So in terms of oatmeal, maybe it's adding 1 to 2 tablespoons of peanut butter, depending how many calories you have to play with. If you're making hash browns, maybe it's 1 to 2 tablespoons of olive oil, avocado oil, coconut oil, something to cook that in, again, depending on how many fats you have to play with. So don't entirely eliminate fats from your diet, but that should kind of be the last consideration because fats are such a calorie dense option. So again, establishing your carb and your protein intake, and then having that fat intake kind of up or down regulate depending on how deep you are in that fat loss phase and how many calories you have to play with. A final consideration is going to be veggie intake. So I didn't include veggies in my initial top 5 list of breakfast foods just because veggies are less of a macronutrient heavy food group and they're much more micronutrient dense. So that doesn't mean that they're not important. You should still have veggies with most, if not all of your meals, but this doesn't make it into that top 5 list. What's also important about veggies is using them as kind of a free snack food when you're in a fat loss phase. So if you start to get hungry in between meals, if you do eat something a little more calorie dense and you're hungry, 1 or 2 hours before that next meal, then having green veggies as kind of those free foods, celery, spinach, green peppers, anything to basically snack on that's going to have very, very few calories to help you get to that next meal. In conclusion, we want to be focusing on complex carb sources that are going to be very satiating and give you sustained energy throughout the day, like oatmeal and hash browns. We also want to be focusing on lean protein sources like Greek yogurt and egg whites that are, again, going to be very filling and help you hit those macronutrients without being too calorie dense. We also want to be focusing on a little bit of fat content, up or down regulating that amount based on how many calories you have to play with.